Tell me, Mrs. Trump, do you actually have an opinion of your own? The words cut through the elegant ballroom like a dagger. For a moment, the room froze. All eyes turned to the stage, where Judge Vivian Caldwell, a towering figure in the legal world, stood with a confident smirk. Melania Trump, poised as ever, sat gracefully across from her at the head table. She had been invited as an honorary guest to this high-profile judicial gala, a night meant to celebrate law and justice, but now it had become a stage for a very public humiliation. Judge Caldwell leaned forward, microphone in hand, her voice dripping with condescension. Or do you simply repeat what powerful men tell you to say? A ripple of uneasy laughter passed through the audience. Some shifted in their seats. Others chuckled, whispering among themselves. Melania didn't flinch. She didn't need to. Because before she could even open her mouth, a chair scraped against the floor. All heads snapped toward the sound. From the front row, Barron Trump stood up. Tall, composed, his eyes locked onto Judge Caldwell with a stare so sharp, so deliberate, that even she hesitated for a split second. The room went dead silent. And then, in a voice calm, steady, and dangerously precise, Barron Trump spoke. "That's an interesting question, Your Honor, but let me ask you something instead." A suffocating silence filled the grand ballroom. Judge Vivian Caldwell, one of the most respected liberal voices in the judiciary, had expected silence from Melania Trump. She had expected an awkward smile, maybe a diplomatic response. What she had not expected was Barron Trump standing up in front of the entire room. The audience, filled with legal elites, politicians, and media personalities, watched in stunned anticipation. Some guests still held their wine glasses midair, frozen in the moment. Barron's eyes remained locked onto Caldwell, his expression unshaken, unreadable. "That's an interesting question, Your Honor." His voice was calm, yet carried a weight that filled the entire room. "But let me ask you something instead." Judge Caldwell raised an eyebrow, attempting to mask her sudden discomfort with a forced chuckle. She took a sip from her champagne flute, acting as if she was still in control. "Oh," she replied, her voice laced with false amusement. "Go ahead, Barron. Enlighten me." Caldwell's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before she quickly recovered. She tilted her head, as if unimpressed. "Well, Barron, I base my opinions on facts, laws, and experience." She gestured toward the crowd, attempting to regain the upper hand. "Unlike some people, I don't take orders from powerful men." Laughter followed. The crowd was back on her side. But Barron? He remained completely still, unshaken. And then he dropped the hammer. "That's interesting," he said, nodding slightly, "because I've read your rulings, Judge Caldwell." The room TENSED ... Caldwell blinked. "You talk about independent thought, but your rulings," he gestured around the room, "are almost always aligned with the same political ideology, the same predictable conclusions, the same talking points." Judge Caldwell stiffened slightly. "Is that true independent thinking? Or just following the agenda of the people who expect you to rule a certain way?" The murmurs in the room grew louder. The tension was shifting. Caldwell's once smug expression darkened. She placed her glass down, her fingers tightening around the stem. She wasn't laughing anymore. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Judge Vivian Caldwell, once the dominant force in this discussion, was now sitting stiffer, more rigid in her chair. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. This event was meant to be a celebration of progressive legal minds, a gathering where like-minded elites could discuss justice, equality, and reform in a setting free from certain political influences. Melania Trump had been invited as a formality, a diplomatic olive branch. No one expected her to fight back. And yet, she hadn't even needed to. Barron Trump had stood up, and now the entire room was listening to him. Caldwell forced a tight smile, lifting her chin slightly as she regained her composure. "Well, Barron, I'm flattered that you've studied my rulings," she said, her voice carefully measured. But legal decisions are based on precedent, ethics, and the greater good, not on what makes people comfortable. A few audience members nodded, as if reassured by her words. But Barron? He didn't nod, he didn't shift, he didn't blink. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his eyes locked on hers with quiet precision. The greater good? He repeated. And who decides that, Judge? You? Caldwell's lips pressed into a thin line. The air tightened. A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Barron took another measured step forward, his voice still calm, controlled, but carrying an undeniable weight. You say you don't take orders from powerful men. His gaze sharpened. But tell me, how many times have you ruled exactly how your party expected you to? Caldwell's grip on her chair tightened. The room was listening now. Barron gestured around, his voice growing just slightly firmer. The truth is, every person in power is influenced by their beliefs, their connections, and yes, even their fears. But you don't acknowledge your own bias. You pretend it doesn't exist. A noticeable shift rippled through the audience. A few glances were exchanged. A few guests who had once been nodding along with Caldwell now sat more thoughtfully, more uncertain. Judge Caldwell noticed. She could feel the shift, and she hated it. Her fingers tapped against the table, her composed demeanor showing its first crack. She had one choice now: take back control. So she did what any seasoned figure in power would do. She went for the personal attack. With a charming but sharp smile, she let out a soft chuckle. Barron, you're a smart young man. But at the end of the day, you're just that young. You haven't studied law. You haven't practiced in the real world. You don't know what it takes to actually make these decisions. A few guests nodded again, reassured. The tension in the room seemed to reset slightly, back in Caldwell's favor. She leaned forward slightly, her smile widening. So tell me, Barron, what exactly makes you think you have the right to question me? The audience waited. They expected Barron to hesitate, to falter, to realize he was out of his depth, but instead, Barron smiled, not arrogantly, not smugly, just a simple, knowing smile. And then he answered. The ballroom held its breath. Judge Vivian Caldwell had just delivered what she thought was the knockout punch, mocking Barron Trump for his age, his inexperience, his lack of authority in legal matters. And in a different setting, with a different opponent, it might have worked. But not tonight, not against Barron Trump. A subtle but unmistakable tension rippled through the audience. Some people, those who had laughed at Caldwell's earlier jabs, were now silent. They weren't sure what was happening, but they could feel it. Something had shifted. The once smug and unshakable Judge Caldwell had finally played her hand. And now? Now it was Barron's turn. He exhaled softly, his knowing smile never faltering. Then, in a voice that was low, steady, and sharper than steel, he spoke. That's an interesting argument, Your Honor. His words were calm, but there was something undeniably powerful beneath them. You assume that experience alone gives you the right to decide who is allowed to speak. That titles and credentials make someone's perspective more valuable than another's. Judge Caldwell's expression stiffened, just slightly. But Barron? He wasn't done. He took another slow step forward, his gaze locked on hers with the intensity of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. But tell me, Judge Caldwell, who in this room actually voted for you? A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. Caldwell blinked. That was not the response she had expected. Barron's voice remained calm, unwavering. I'll save you the trouble, no one. A heavier murmur, a few nervous shifts in seats. Even those who had blindly supported Caldwell minutes earlier were now listening a little differently. Because, Your Honor, unlike my father, unlike the officials in this room, judges like you are appointed, not elected, not chosen by the people, but placed into power by those who expect you to rule a certain way. The silence in the room was thick now. Judge Caldwell's eyes narrowed. This was dangerous territory. But Barron was just getting started. You sit here lecturing me on experience, as if wisdom is only measured by time served in a position of power." His tone was still measured, but it carried the weight of a storm approaching. "But tell me, Your Honor, when was the last time you actually had to answer for your decisions? When was the last time you had to explain to the people, not to the legal elite, not to the media, but to everyday Americans, why you rule the way you do?" Judge Caldwell's jaw clenched. She knew the answer. She had never had to. Not really. Her rulings were discussed in academic circles, analyzed by legal experts, praised by the media. But she had never not once been held accountable by the people. And Barron knew it. And now so did everyone else in the room. A shift began. It was subtle at first. A few glances exchanged. A few people who had entered the night completely on Caldwell's side were now hesitating. Barron Trump had just done something no one else in this room had dared to do. He had called out the untouchable. He had challenged power itself. And for the first time all evening, Judge Caldwell looked like she was on the defensive. She needed to regain control fast. So she straightened up, forced another smirk, and prepared to strike back. But the problem? Barron had one more card to play. And it was about to change everything. A heavy silence filled the ballroom. Judge Vivian Caldwell, once confident, once untouchable, was now staring at a problem she hadn't anticipated. A young man who was not intimidated by power. Barron Trump's words still lingered in the air, cutting through the polished conversations, the polite laughter, the air of superiority that had filled this room all evening. The guests, elite judges, politicians, and media figures were no longer watching this as an entertaining exchange. They were watching a moment where the power dynamics had shifted. For the first time in her career, Judge Caldwell wasn't the one leading the conversation. And she hated it. She exhaled slowly, straightened her posture, and forced a condescending smile. "You make an interesting point, Barron," she said, her tone laced with forced patience. "But you seem to misunderstand something very basic about how the law works." Her voice was steady, but the slight tension in her jaw gave her away. Judges aren't politicians. We don't campaign, we don't seek approval from the public. Our job is to interpret the law, not to win a popularity contest. Some guests nodded along, reassured by her words. A small wave of murmurs rippled through the audience. Was she regaining control? Caldwell seized on it. She turned her gaze back to Barron, her confidence returning. "You criticize me for being appointed rather than elected, but tell me, should justice be decided by public opinion? Should we hold court cases like reality TV competitions where the loudest voices win?" She chuckled lightly, shaking her head. "I get it, Barron. Your father built an empire by winning people over, by using influence and popularity. But the law isn't about influence, it's about facts, about wisdom. And that's something that only comes with experience." More guests nodded. Some even clapped softly. Judge Caldwell could feel it. Her grip on the room was tightening again. She sat back, a smirk playing at the corner of her lips, believing she had finally put Barron in his place. But then, he spoke again, and everything changed. Barron took a slow breath. He wasn't shaken. He wasn't thrown off. And that unnerved her. His voice was steady, carrying through the room without needing to be loud. "You're right, Your Honor," he said. "The law shouldn't be about popularity." Caldwell's smirk widened, but then Barron leaned in slightly. His expression didn't change, his voice didn't rise. But his next words landed like a thunderclap. "So why do you care so much about being praised for your rulings?" The murmurs stopped. Caldwell blinked. Just for a second. Just enough for people to notice. But Barron wasn't done. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes locked onto hers with unnerving precision. "You claim judges don't seek approval, that your job is simply to interpret the law, that you don't care about influence." His gaze didn't waver. "Then tell me, why do your rulings always seem to match exactly what the media, the political elite, and the activists want to hear? the room shifted. A few people stiffened in their seats. Caldwell's fingers tightened on the armrest of her chair. "Barron, that's—" she began. "No, really," he interrupted, not rudely but firmly. "If you're truly independent, if you don't care about approval, why is it that every single time there's a high-profile case, your decisions seem to align perfectly with whatever movement is trending at the time?" The air in the room grew thick. Caldwell's smile had vanished completely. This was no longer an exchange of ideas. This was a reckoning. Barron continued, his tone still calm, still dangerously precise. "The law is supposed to be blind, isn't it? Yet somehow, it always seems to favor the same side, the same talking points, the same activists, the same politics. Is that wisdom, Your Honor?" A flicker of something crossed Caldwell's face. For the first time all night, she didn't have an immediate answer. The audience noticed. The murmurs turned into whispers. People who had walked in believing this would be a simple takedown of the Trump family were now seeing something else entirely. They were seeing a judge struggle to justify her own contradictions, and Caldwell could feel it. Her mind raced for a counter, a way to regain control, a way to make Barron lose momentum. And then she saw her opening. She straightened, forced a smirk, and delivered her final blow. "You know, Barron, for someone who claims to dislike politics, you certainly sound like a politician yourself." She leaned back slightly, shaking her head in mock amusement. "Tell me, are you planning on running for office? Or is this just another attempt from the Trump family to stay relevant?" A few audience members laughed, some even clapped. It was an old trick, but a reliable one. Discredit the argument by making it about ambition, not truth. Make the opponent look like they have a personal motive. Caldwell could feel the shift. The room was listening to her again. She thought she had won, but then Barron smiled. Not in amusement, not in arrogance, but in realization. Like someone who had just seen exactly how the game was played. And then, with the calmest voice in the room, he ended it all. "That's the difference between you and me, Judge. I don't need power to speak the truth." Boom! The room froze. Judge Caldwell's face went blank. Her fingers curled into fists. Because she knew this wasn't just a loss. This was an exposure. And everyone in the room had just witnessed it. A heavy silence hung over the ballroom. Judge Vivian Caldwell, once the dominant voice in this conversation, now sat in complete stillness. She had tried everything: mockery, condescension, even a direct attack on Barron Trump's motives. And yet, none of it had worked, because Barron's final words still echoed through the room. "That's the difference between you and me, Judge. I don't need power to speak the truth." It was more than just a comeback. It was a statement that exposed everything. And now? The audience, once filled with polite laughter and quiet arrogance, was beginning to question everything. Judge Caldwell's fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass. She needed to recover fast. Forcing a chuckle, she shook her head. "Well, Barron, I have to admit, you certainly know how to hold a room." She gestured toward the audience, her voice smooth, but with an unmistakable edge of tension. "But let's be honest, what you just did isn't wisdom, it's performance." Some audience members nodded hesitantly, hoping Caldwell could turn the tide. She continued, her tone carefully measured. "It's easy to criticize people in power when you've never had to carry the responsibility yourself. You talk about truth, about fairness, but tell me, do you even understand what it means to make real, difficult decisions?" She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Have you ever had to decide the fate of someone's life with the stroke of a pen?" The murmurs in the crowd grew. The question hung in the air. She had just challenged Barron Trump directly. She had just demanded an answer. And the crowd was waiting, watching, expecting him to falter. But Barron? He didn't hesitate. His expression remained steady. His voice, when he spoke, was even calmer than before. "I may not be a judge, Your Honor, but I do know what happens when people in power forget who they serve." The room went dead silent. Judge Caldwell's smirk faded slightly, but Barron wasn't done. He took a slow step forward, his voice dropping just slightly, not in volume, but in weight. When my father was in office, people like you called him a tyrant for every executive order, every ruling, every policy. He tilted his head, studying her. But tell me, Judge, how many times have you ever questioned the unchecked power of unelected judges? Judge Caldwell's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The audience was frozen. But Barron Trump had just shattered that illusion. And now, for the first time in years, people were questioning it. Judge Caldwell's jaw tightened. She could feel the energy shifting. She needed to end this now. She leaned back, exhaling sharply. Well, Barron, I suppose we'll just have to agree to disagree. It was a retreat disguised as grace. A polite way to escape without admitting defeat. But the problem? The audience wasn't buying it. Barron Trump had done more than just hold his own. He had flipped the entire conversation. What started as a public mockery of Melania Trump had become a moment of reckoning for an entire institution. And everyone in the room had witnessed it. Judge Caldwell lifted her glass to her lips, taking a long sip, hiding the stiffness in her face. She had lost, and Barron Trump? He had just walked out of this room more powerful than when he walked in. And just like that, the conversation was over. But was it really? Judge Caldwell thought she had control, but Barron Trump turned the entire room against her. Now it's your turn to decide. Was his response the ultimate takedown? Or do you think the judge had a point? Let me know in the comments. And if you don't want to miss more powerful moments like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. See you in the next one.